national president, because she has quite an important announcement about the publication of the papers at this conference and a couple of announcements about two of the leaflets on the table. Dot. Or just anywhere. Yes.
I thought I was off duty today, so I haven't brought the gong. Well, first of all, there's two leaflets on the table. One is about the web project that some of you, if you were at the annual meetings, will know a little bit about. This leaflet will tell you how to get involved. And actually, what we've been doing today, I think, is something that fits perfectly with developing this web project. It's an ideal place to put these things. So please pick up one of these, and if you want to get involved, contact Rachel. And the other is about the college, Unitarian College Manchester, and its project, doing ministry together. We had a session on this at the annual meetings. That was an exploratory first session. We'd really like to know your views on such things as what is the role of the congregation, the lay leader, what training, different skills and experiences, and how these should be recognized. Again, you know, you've been here today. I think it's been fabulous, to be honest. Please get involved. Let us know what you think. That way we can position what we're doing in the future. So please pick up these off the table. But when I heard Jim say, well, some of the papers will be published in Faith and Freedom, and if they're not, contact the people who delivered them, I thought, well, that's messy, and this is too important. So I suppose with different hats on, I am going to try and influence getting all the papers from today together, publishing them in some form that is accessible to everybody, and making that the first of a series. So don't worry about contacting the individual presenters. That's far too messy for you, and it's certainly too messy for them to be responding to different people. So I suppose I'm saying my commitment is to find a way of putting these together, whether it's in Faith and Freedom or in a separate thing sponsored maybe by the Hibbert Trust. I can't promise that because we're not all here today, but we'll find a way to get these things published. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dot. And we'll now move straight on to the keynote presentation towards a Unitarian theology for the 21st century. I should just say that David Steers is a minister in our sister denomination in Ireland, the non-subscribing Presbyterian, and in congregations of Downpatrick, Balee, and Clough. He was educated for the ministry at Unitarian College Manchester. He holds degrees from Oxford, Manchester, and Glasgow universities, and he's editor of our two theological journals, really, Faith and Freedom and the Transactions of the Unitarian Historical Society. He's a native of Liverpool, and I'm afraid, although I can read his talk, I won't try to imitate his Liverpudlian burr. Towards a Unitarian theology for the 21st century. I always feel very privileged, writes David Steers, to have not only been trained for the ministry at the Unitarian College Manchester, but also to have studied theology in what was then the Faculty of Theology at Manchester University. Both institutions, plus the input of what was then called the Northern Federation for Training in Ministry, made for a seriously professional, high-grade 3 years of training, a training in theology. At the center of that period for me was the advice, example, intellect, teaching knowledge and anecdotes of the principal at the time, the Reverend Arthur Long. Arthur's theological knowledge within Unitarianism was unsurpassed. It was as broad as it was deep, academically robust, and tied in to an extensive pastoral experience, a combination that is actually very rare for those who teach in theological colleges or theology faculties. Because of his position in the faculty and the Federation, Arthur interacted fully and creatively with every shade of theology in the Christian tradition. In fact, he had always done this throughout his ministry, as can be seen in his still useful book, published by the Lindsay Press as long ago as 1963, Faith and Understanding, Critical Essays in Christian Doctrine. And one of the central elements of his teaching within Unitarian College Manchester was a full, detailed, and comprehensive course in Unitarian theology. This was an invaluable grounding for anyone preparing for the ministry, an absolutely essential examination of Unitarian theological ideas, their origins, development, and contemporary relevance. I can't imagine being equipped for the ministry without it, and look back on nearly 30 years of ministry, the first 10 of them spent in Belfast during the still ongoing Troubles, as being underpinned by what I learnt from Arthur. Most casual outsiders would take something like this for granted. Isn't that what you do and what you go to theological college for? Isn't that what you do in a theology degree? Learn about theology, learn to think theologically. Unfortunately, that is increasingly not how Unitarianism chooses to present itself. It wasn't always that way. In the 18th century, Joseph Priestley set himself the task of producing a theological statement of what he believed in every year, and his expression of his own personal Unitarian theology went through 30,000 copies in multiple editions in 15 years. What has developed increasingly as the 21st century has progressed is an attitude that is anti-theological, that essentially makes a virtue of having no intellectual rootedness, that denies any kind of structural, thoughtful basis for Unitarianism. This process has probably been accelerated by the revision of the objects, originally in the 1990s, which out of fear of providing prescriptive, absolute terms of what Unitarianism is about, instead spoke only in terms of vague principles. If I'd been with you here today, I was going to begin this talk with a game called Unitarian or Not Unitarian. I had a succession of theological quotes from different people in different eras, and it would have been your job to identify if you thought it was a Unitarian speaking or not. The idea would be not only to show the shifting sands of what might constitute Unitarianism, but also the changing perceptions of Unitarians of what might or might not be included within the Unitarian canon of belief. You'll just have to take my word for it that it would have been a really good game. But it was meant to highlight the uncertainty and vagueness that has crept into Unitarianism as a body of ideas, as a credible collection of thinking responses to the world in terms of its theological challenges. The late Professor R.K. Webb put it like this when reviewing the 20th century. As it lost its theological content, Unitarian thinking seemed to splinter into competing enthusiasms, a fascination with non-Christian religions, social service, socialism, the peace movement, temperance, vegetarianism, even spiritualism. That phrase, competing enthusiasms, always seems a particularly painful barb, and it is painful because it is accurate. although some of his other phrases are not perhaps too resonant in the second decade of the 21st century, some are. And the other undeniably important phrase in Webb's quotation is his opener, as Unitarianism lost its theological content. There can be no doubt, continues David Steers, that Unitarianism has lost its theological content and sometimes seems to rejoice in this. Those who were present at the General Assembly this year will have seen the film From Vision to Action, Next Steps, Video and Report. This is well put together and an engaging video, and parts of it are quite encouraging, positive and uplifting. But there's also an undercurrent that is actually anti-congregational and anti-theological. Partly this comes from the entirely laudatory desire to create and explore new ways of being church. And as ever with Unitarians, there is a very touching sense of people thinking they are doing something entirely new, when in fact mainstream churches have already rolled out similar projects such as Fresh Expressions, which work on the same desire to create new ways of interacting with sections of society that have no time for organized religion. Although the whole Unitarian Vision project is meant to support the development of new and rekindled congregations without diverting General Assembly resources from existing congregations and other ongoing efforts, end quote, you get the impression, though, through phrases used in the film such as, I think we have to break out of the church model, we are not about church, prayer, the focus is kindness, not theology, we are looking for people to be active on a national level, that there is little on offer to sustain congregational life of any traditional type. This is a pity, because the very heart of any religious movement, but particularly in the kind of tradition which we represent, is always the congregation. And this is where most theological discourse will take place. Andrew Hill, our premier historian, Andrew Hill set out the importance of the congregation in a piece written a few years ago. Quote, a church is like a tree. Once sown and given the right conditions, it is required to grow by its very nature. Its tap root will reach down to, quote, the inexhaustible depth and ground of all its being, Paul Tillich, while its surface roots will draw on the rich nutrients disclosed by the many Christs and bodhisattvas who have shared our humanity, leaving us deep wells of wisdom. By its nature, a church is radical. That means it has roots, providing anchorage, strength, and direction. A church draws on these resources, conserves them from dissipation and loss, and renews them in its transgenerational community. A church is a concentrated stream of life, struggling through increasingly disordered surroundings. End quote. We have to nourish our congregational life. We have to value it and the shared ministries that flow from it. There are lots of things congregations can and should do, but unless they have some idea of who they are and what they are about, they will have no lasting impact. Generally, given that a major proportion of our congregations can be dated back to the 17th century, it is reasonable to assume that they have been fairly secure in their identity and purpose. Few institutions last for more than a generation or so. Those that do, like church congregations, must be something of value. I have started with congregations because I believe they are the base communities of our theological and communal project. It is not the only type of community. There are other ways they can and should be developed, but they are a given and our traditional way of working. Famously, T.S. Eliot expresses this idea: what life have you if you have not life together? There is not life that is not in community, and no community not lived in praise of God. End quote. But with that community in mind, let's explore the theological basis for the Unitarian movement. About 8 years ago, writes David Steers, I was offered a very good job in England related to work in a religious sphere, although not the ministry. For various reasons, I didn't take it up. But unusually for me, the interview went quite well. Until the final question, when the chair of the panel, a Baptist, asked what was the USP, the unique selling point, of the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church or the Unitarian Church. I hadn't expected what is a perfectly good, even obvious question, and began to explain the cultural and historical differences between Irish non-subscription and English Unitarianism. But then I realized that there was a very simple answer, one that I believe encompasses both the NSBCI, the non-subscribers, and the General Assembly, our General Assembly, and which, if I didn't believe in it, I wouldn't be a minister in this tradition. And if I didn't believe it, it was what the movement stood for, I wouldn't stay in it. I replied then, that the USP, the unique selling point of the Unitarian movement, was that it successfully balanced the twin faculties of faith and reason. If we depart from either of these, we abandon our principles and our identity. We become, to adapt a quotation from James Martineau, a traitor to our spiritual ancestry and a deserter to the camp of its persecutors. End quote. If we overemphasize one against the other, then we start to lose our purpose. Without faith, we fail to be guided by a power greater than ourselves. We lose the roots for our social action and witness in the world. Without reason, we have no safeguard against being led astray and no protection against delusion. Sorry, I seem to have skipped. And no protection against delusion. Once upon a time, it might have been thought that it is the faith side of the equation that is most often jettisoned by Unitarians today. But I think, unfortunately, reason has frequently been forgotten in some manifestations of Unitarian belief in recent years. A church or denomination without either faith or reason seems particularly pitiable. We have to be a people of faith, or there really is no point in turning up. We have to own and share a faith that is vibrant and vital, a living thing that we share with enthusiasm and joy. Without that, we really have no point. In the Psalms it says, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. And our faith should make us glad. We should be uplifted by it. In the end, it is what sustains us. The countless people we meet who declare that they like to make up their own minds, or don't like being told what to believe, or like to think for themselves, etc., and who we confidently declare to be part of that much vaunted tribe of people who are Unitarians without knowing it. Generally, these people can see no point in why they should come to church, or become part of a wider community. But if they do come, then they need to connect with what that community stands for, with its faith. And we need to be sure about who we are. Why is it, we might ask, that the not entirely dissimilar Quakers have a much higher recognition factor in the population in general, and also are able to participate much more easily in ecumenical institutions, for example? In part, it is something to do with knowing and understanding their own tradition. If we knew our own tradition better, we would be more confident and more open to participation in the broader religious life of this country. In theological terms, at its most basic level, any church or movement or denomination operates within a matrix that pulls it in three directions. Put simply, these are scripture, tradition, and culture. A lot of Unitarians would demur at two of these. I've already tried at two of these: scripture, tradition, and culture. These three he's setting out. We operate within that matrix. A lot of Unitarians would demur at two of these. I've already tried to suggest why tradition is actually very important. History has bequeathed us many things. One of them is a remarkable set of congregational buildings, which are very often extremely valuable resources in prime sites if we knew how to use them. Yet I have seen Unitarians struggle on public occasions to explain why they possess a large Gothic church with stained glass windows, a chancel, and all the rest of it, or why they possess a quaint little chapel of great antiquity. But if we take the congregation as the prime place where theological discourse should take place, let's start by looking at the local tradition where appropriate. Who built this? Why did they build it? Why here? Who has been involved? What did they do? What did they believe? How do we relate to them? What physical archives do we possess? What is this valuable-looking communion plate? Should we find out more about it, give it to a museum, or sell it at auction with an incorrect provenance? I write this as a former assistant minister of Cross Street Chapel. I think this refers to a real event, so we'd better pass swiftly on. After we have examined the local tradition, let's look at the wider picture. Who was Joseph Priestley? What was important about James Martineau? What happened in 1662? There are many more questions like this, but it's important to know the stories. It is the tradition that colors and shapes us. We shouldn't be limited by it or so absorbed in it that we lose sight of the future, but we should use it as a foundation for what we do today. Tradition is not something any religion can function without. It's often pointed out that all tradition at some point has to be invented. If we don't value our tradition, we have nothing to test new ideas on. In many ways, Unitarians could be very vulnerable to infiltration by outside groups, and it's surprising there have been so few attempts at this. Although this chapel was once subject to a very serious takeover bid from outside. Moving on then from tradition to Scripture. So what about Scripture? This could cause more discomfort to modern Unitarians than anything else. But really it shouldn't. Leaving aside for now the history of interpretation and translation of the Bible, in which Unitarians have played a not unimportant part at times, let's acknowledge that our attitude cannot be the same as it was at any period in the past. But if we jettison the Bible completely, we miss out on an engagement with the divine in human affairs that has resonated in our world for thousands of years. It has done this because it contains some sort of truth, but it does require effort to uncover this truth. Not making that effort is another way of diminishing our acquaintance with spiritual questions. If we abandon all Scripture, we will be tempted to replace it with the facile and the superficial. With regard to culture, this is another area where there is a creative tension. The third area now, culture. Another area where there is a creative tension. We can't speak to culture unless we are to some extent outside it. We can't have an impact unless we are also in it. The late Robert Runcie, former Archbishop of Canterbury, said, "A church which listens only to its own tradition will end up speaking only to itself. A church which listens only to what is happening in the world will end up becoming only a dull echo of the latest fashion." End quote. I'm sure he didn't have Unitarians in mind when he said that, but it clearly is a problem for us at times. Rising to be part of wider society is something that every individual church should aspire to. Another great Unitarian, H.L. Short, Harry Lismer Short, examining the role of religious dissent in the community, put it like this: great causes do not die because of opposition. Usually opposition is a stimulus. Nor do they die because of internal differences. Often these arouse debate and emulation. They are more likely to collapse because of inner weariness and a loss of contact with the mainstream of life in the community. A church must not only preach to its already converted members a doctrine which they consider true, it must have an effective place in the world. It must have some contemporary relevance, some function in the social order, some contribution to make to the intellectual life of the time. Liberty is not permission to withdraw from the world's battles. We are not mere quietists. But we exist in other contexts, end quote. But we exist in other contexts too. A major change in British society over the last 40 years has been the vast expansion of the numbers of followers of other world religions. Gradually, the contact and exchange between the different religions has increased, but I'm not sure that Unitarians, while being keen, have had that much positive impact. You have to have something to bring to interfaith debate for any constructive dialogue to take place. Many years ago, in fact, when I was at school, I was struck by the validity of the picture, which I heard presented by a Unitarian minister on television, of religion being like a mountain, and everyone on the mountain finding their own way to the summit. Each person, each religion has had its own route, but they were all engaged essentially in the same process. I now realize that this is true, but you still have to climb that mountain yourself. It is not enough to observe. You have to engage with the process yourself. One of the problems with the self-expressed pluralism of Unitarianism in recent decades is that it hinders rather than helps engagement with the divine. Cliff Reed put it like this in a letter to the Inquirer a few years ago. Copies are there. An extract. A liberal congregation that is firmly rooted theologically is actually better able to meet the needs of the range of faith positions that can be categorized as part of our tradition. From a firm yet truly liberal standpoint, it is possible to be more open to other views, voices, and spiritual experiences than otherwise. Cliff Reed also went on to quote a passage from the American rabbi's prayer book, Gates of Prayer. I cannot be religious without belonging to a particular religion, any more than I can talk without using a particular language. So we do become fluent again in our own religion. If we want to speak to people of faiths, of other faiths, we have to have a faith of our own. David Steers writes, as a member of the Council of the International Association for Religious Freedom, the IARF, for 10 years, I was very blessed to be able to work, discuss, and worship with people from all over the world who were members of all the main world religions and some of the minor ones. Under the leadership of Robert Treyer and Andrew Clark, the IARF became a very effective organization for interfaith dialogue and for education supporting religious freedom. But for some decades before, its focus had been somewhere else. It had been a proponent of what was then called liberal religion. This was very much a buzzword within Unitarianism that thankfully seems to have had its day. It was based on a premise that there was some kind of fellowship between followers of liberal religion from all over the world. This was fine when the context was, as it had been originally, liberal Christianity, but had no real meaning as a term in a broader sense. It was a concept rarely unknown and unfamiliar amongst many groups in Asia, for instance, who were liberal and religious, but were not liberal religions. Yet this idea was pushed very hard for decades and had a baleful influence on Unitarianism in Britain. It had its roots in the United States and was probably the main theological element of international relations for the Unitarian Universalist Association. It went out of fashion because the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, developed new structures for relating with the rest of the world, which, put simply, posited themselves as part of a global religion of UUs, Unitarian Universalists. This ignores the fact that UUs only rarely exist in the United States or in places where there are concentrations of UUs from the United States. Yet increasingly in Britain, you can see the use of Unitarian Universalism as the name of churches or of the movement or of people here. We are essentially being rebranded. One of the problems with this is that almost everyone who uses the term Universalist here in Britain, who is not themselves from America, probably does not realize that it refers to a denomination which promoted the Christian notion of universal salvation rather than some kind of all faiths approach. There is an effort to harness a version of tradition to this new world religion. Andrea Greenwood in Mark Harris's book, An Introduction to the Unitarian and Universalist Traditions, acknowledges the difference, but still tries to weld the history, practices, and beliefs of Transylvanian or British Unitarians to the UUA. But again, if we acquaint ourselves with our own tradition in our own society, if we establish dialogue with our neighbors and participate in activities where we can do so with other churches and other religions, we will find purpose and direction. Our position in a society that still has an established religion is one of dissent, a concept basically unknown in most American history. Britain is also a far less religiously defined society. It is increasingly secularized, while at the same time accommodating more diversity, quite unlike the United States, where some sort of orthodox religion is generally a given for most people. We have to find ways to engage with the situation as we encounter it. I don't believe there is any real market for atheist-inspired churches here. There may be in America. There may be in America where the concept of church or religious observance is such a strong one, even those who've abandoned any traditional religious allegiance can still find purpose in the outer symbols of religiosity, but that has few echoes here in Britain. What we do have here in this country, which appears to be quite successful and which is very proudly, defiantly atheist, is the so-called Sunday Assembly. But watch one of their videos, observe the gleeful earnestness of the participants, take in the arm-waving, the singing, and excitement of the mainly youthful participants. Then watch a video of, say, worship at Holy Trinity Brompton in London and Kensington, the home of the Alpha Course, of a kind of Christian fundamentalism. And tell me the difference, writes David Steers, between the Sunday Assembly crowd and Holy Trinity Brompton crowd. If you turned the sound down, you wouldn't be able to tell the one from the other. There may be things we can learn from both the Sunday Assembly and Holy Trinity Brompton, but as rational dissenters, surely we stand somewhere else. We have a tradition of rational dissent that has to include an engagement with faith. I don't believe there are many people who want to come to church just to discuss religion. We have to do more than that. But it is a daunting task. Harry Lismer Short observed this decades ago. A church cannot live merely by consuming its own ideas. Willingly or not, it must join in the general debate. Our ancestors in the 18th century made an effort to bridge the gap between Christian faith and the new scientific worldview. Science and its child technology now rule the world, and Christian orthodoxy, in spite of ecumenical enthusiasm, is a minority and an irrelevance. But where do we stand? It is not enough to say that we believe in freedom of inquiry and that this is enough to put us on the side of science. Is religion of any kind, whether liberal or orthodox, relevant in our secular world? What do we contribute to the great debate of our time? The first task is to hold our own line, to build our communities, communities that are open and engaged, that are familiar with who we are and what we stand for. Andrew Hill puts it like this: in a growing church, always the commanding vision is in control. Not the building, not the committee, not the treasurer, not the dead hand of the past, not the lay and or professional ministry, but the commanding vision. A growing church is one that worships and prays and reads scripture and celebrates, and flinches not from every possible occasion when the commanding vision can be set before it. That quote from Andrew Hill. Have we got a commanding vision? Something that is truly our own and true to our identity, history, and tradition? If we have, then we will grow. As I've said, it needs to combine both faith and reason. It needs to exist at the confluence of the two. I'll give the last word to Arthur Long. The trend which I would like to see growing and prospering within contemporary Unitarianism is one which, while insisting on the one hand that religion is meaningless without symbolism, metaphor, mystery, and imagination, nevertheless also remains quietly confident that what we need above all is an undiminished trust in reason and intellectual argument. And that quote from Arthur Long concludes the paper from the Reverend Dr. David Steers. So we'll give him a clap. And let's just take a few moments of quiet before we break for a short coffee break before the final session. Let's just take a few moments of quiet to let our minds grow still. Thank you. Could we take a 10-minute break now, just over 10 minutes, be back here at 5 to 4? Would that be all right? Good. See you then. It's going to be very good, the panel discussion, so don't miss it, I can assure you.
We're going to break now, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.